the tech sector from the solution is becoming the fifth element of capture, because if you as an independent journalism, you cannot take a job in the public media in your country because it's controlled by the government. You cannot take a job in private media because they are controlled by the government. You cannot get a grant because the money is given to government controlled media. Now you lose even this space where you could actually openly set up your own media outlet because this is controlled by the government. When you look at what you have, because of how the tech is changing, we are kind of stuck.
When you're stuck, there are always ways to get unstuck. In this episode of AI Fluent, we're discussing different solutions for how the media industry can become less dependent on big tech. Marius Dragomir, the founding director of the Media and Journalism Research Center, shares with me the most surprising findings from his recent research on propaganda narratives, as well as the revealing discoveries about ownership and financial aspects of the 100 AI tools most used by journalists. I started this conversation by asking Marius my favorite question: what excites him about generative AI tools and their use in the context of storytelling?
Well, there are many things that excite me. First of all, I think it's a very practical aspect, which is the fact that you can stop wasting time doing a lot of jobs that can be and tasks that can be automatically done through AI tools, something that we didn't have 30 years ago. So this is great because you can use a lot of that time instead for example, for investigative journalism and reporting. Or we are using some tools with my colleagues now in our research work. When you have, for example, a huge database, which again, in the old times, when we worked on paper, it was, days and days of searching through information. Now you can use such tools to actually go through them. And sometimes you may find angles and information that you didn't even think about and you could have missed. So there are many things related to AI that excite me. At the same time, I think we have to be careful how it is being used. Of course, there are many ways and many aspects to it that are very important. But when it comes to our field, media and journalism, I think it's very important to see how this is used, for example, for producing research journalism. We have a policy in our center, in fact, where we disclose every time we publish something, we disclose all the AI tools that have been used for generating a research project. And we forbid experts, writers, experts, researchers, editors to use tools that generate content from scratch. So we use it, for example, for translation and checking grammar, but we never accept a product that is entirely produced by AI tools.
Who knows, by the way, how these kind of things will change in 5 years? Because what is normal today might become not normal in 5 years. The norms will change. And we will talk about this a bit later because I want to talk to you about regulations and ethics. But first, I wanted to ask you about one of your institute's recent research articles was titled Ownership and Financial Insights of AI Used in Journalism. And fantastically, I think you looked into the 100 AI tools most used by journalists and found that only 33% of AI tool companies demonstrate sufficient transparency, with 67% lacking critical data on ownership, finances, and other basic information. And there is one AI-powered fact-checking tool you mentioned there called Clarity, owned by former Israeli military personnel. The owners promoted it as the best fact-checking or one of the best fact-checking tools for the Israeli-Palestinian war. They claim the tool is used by Bloomberg, Financial Times, The Sun, and Fortune, among others. What was the response from the journalistic community to this kind of findings? Was there any response?
Yes, there was that project, in fact, was one of the most used and cited reports that we have published recently. It was in fact carried out by one of our youngest researchers, Sydney Martin, and she has to get all the credit for that because she has worked more than a year collecting data about AI companies. The focus again was not on any AI company, but on AI companies offering tools to media outlets or producing tools for media outlets and journalists. So we had a set of criteria that we used in selecting the companies. Well, first of all, the findings are very important. I think it was very important for us to raise this issue because there are many ways AI is being tackled and discussed, of course. And there are many great organizations doing work about the regulation, the ethics behind it, and all that. But as we have seen in our field in media and journalism, knowing who owns and who controls and who finances a company is extremely important, probably the most important, because I think if you look at a media outlet and how it behaves and how it operates, it has to do to a large extent to its ownership connection. So our question was, this is great. We have this AI revolution and a lot of companies producing tools that will probably empower media outlets or lead to major changes in the media field. But the question is, who owns these companies and who finances them? Of course, there is, in terms of financing, there is a wave of cash injections and investments taking place in the AI field, and this is great. In my view, I think we are experiencing also a bubble because a lot of money is going into some promised tools in all the fields, not only the media. But when it comes to ownership structures, I think it's really important to know who they own them, especially because what I foresee in the journalism field is that these companies will become producers of narratives. They are already able to actually produce anything. An AI company is able to produce a journal at a very low cost and update it every day. So at some point we are talking about a direct competitor in the media production and content production field. And not only because of that, but because of that as well, I think we have to know who owns these companies. Now, the findings were a bit shocking because, to be very honest, I expected them to be more transparent. I think in some cases, it's not about the fact that they are trying to hide their traces. It's just about, I guess, in some cases, the lack of accountability or the lack of awareness of why that is important. Even putting the name of your owner on the website. I think some of them never think about it, but this will become extremely important. I think the findings are quite troubling. Some media outlets reacted to that. The way people and journalists and the community reacted to the study was to actually take more seriously this issue, and I hope we'll look more into that. And I guess we are now at a stage where a lot of these companies are owned by and funded by investors and by tech people. But when we look at what is happening in social media and in media in the US, for example, after the elections, we might not rule out the fact that one day some of these companies, will change ownership and be owned by, governments, Saudi princes, businesses in India, Europe, or all over the place. And especially for the media field, it's very important to have transparency over these ownership structures.
How do you think this opacity might affect journalistic independence and credibility in the long term, especially when reporters might not fully understand the biases and limitations of the AI tools they're using?
Well, I think it's the answer is in your question. It's a great question, and I think it's important not only to know who owns these tools, especially for example, if you are a public service broadcaster, if you are a media outlet that is funded from taxpayers' money, you have an even more higher responsibility to, in fact, be very aware from where you outsource your tools, because I don't think it's ethical, and sometimes it might be problematic from a security point of view to use tools produced by I don't know what company controlled by I don't know what rogue government. So it's a very important issue, and I think media outlets and journalists have to think twice and have probably kind of protocol in place or a policy in place where from the onset it should be important to before using any tool. And of course, I'm not talking here about grammar checks or translation companies, but before using any tools that has to do with generating content, to have a double check on who owns these companies, how they finance themselves, why they exist, how they actually build the AI tools.
And who owns the data, especially when you do some investigations and you feed tons of data, sometimes sensitive data, into these tools. Where does it all end up?
That's a great question. I think that, well, you have a number of scholars, who have been looking into these issues for quite a long time now. Huge question, and it has to do, as you just said, with who actually controls the data. When you use content from a media outlet to generate other content, or however you use the content generated by third parties, meaning journalists and media outlets, the question is, what are not only the ethical issues behind it, but of course the regulatory issues, the legal issues, and in the end, it's a matter of who owns the data and who's actually the owner, for example, of the entirely generated report, a journalistic report or research report. These are questions that are not answered yet. People are talking about them, and there is, as you know very well, a lot of debate about these issues. And I think we have to actually have those debates for the future, for a healthy future of journalism and the media. And of course, AI tools are used in many other fields. We are on a very limited space here, but it's our field, and we are talking about that. But of course, the implications for other industries probably are much higher.
Interesting. So BBC just released a damning research on AI assistance news accuracy. Their test of ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, and Perplexity exposed major flaws. 51% of AI responses had significant issues. 19% introduced errors when citing BBC, 13% misquoted or made up BBC content entirely. So kind of bottom line, AI assistants fail at basic news reporting accuracy. Will it stop anyone from using these tools? Of course not. Will they become better? Of course they will. Will majority of people care about news reporting accuracy and facts? And that's a question for me.
That is very complicated. In fact, we are studying in a recent project what we call the propaganda narratives across the world, and trying to understand who's producing content and who's consuming it and in what way. And of course, there are many nuances there and a lot of details to talk about. But essentially, what you look at when you look at the public sphere, you have a lot of content these days being produced by governments, sponsored, funded, or produced directly by governments or media outlets or entities funded by the government. That's a huge area of content. Then you have a big area of content produced on social networks, and this is both produced by the population. And in fact, as we all know, social media are in fact using the content produced by people and users, and that is a very huge amount of content. That is in fact a source of information for many people. Many people get informed simply from social media or friends. Then you have a lot of communication and content being produced on private networks. This is something that is very hard to research because you don't have access to that, but a lot of people, communities, groups are producing content and conversations on Messenger, on WhatsApp and other private networks. And then you have the fourth area of content that is produced by media and journalism, what we call editorialized content. And in this field, in fact, media and journalism are losing a lot of space because there is a lot of so-called competition from the other sectors. Now, when you look at all this type of content, only the media and journalists have as we call it, a problem with fact-checking, and they actually have to invest in fact-checking, reporting, and so on. Government communication, people's communication, they don't care about that. They just throw out a lot of content. And when you look at this whole landscape with the AI tools becoming more sophisticated, of course, who's going to win in this game, which is a lot of the quantity related, are going to be those who do not have the fact-checking task on their list. So back to your question, I think looking at all these issues, it's a problem, especially for media outlets when using AI tools, to always have a human brain, so to speak, in the process. We finished last year a project about how newsrooms are using AI tools in Central and Eastern Europe. We chose a number of outlets, and we carried out that research based on interviews with journalists. But one issue that surfaced from all of them was the fact that exactly what you described, you cannot rely on AI tools from the beginning till the end. You have to, at least at the end, you need, especially if you want to believe that you are a respected media outlet, you need someone to actually check the final content, even if you don't have the capacity to do it all the way, but you cannot rely at all. And I think you will never be able to rely. They will never be perfect. And again, governments and propaganda outlets, they don't care about that. I'm sure they will produce, and nobody checks anyways what is happening on these channels. But when it comes to media and journalism, that's something that will become even more important.
So let's talk a little bit deeper about disinformation and propaganda narratives in different parts of the world. So could you share any examples that surprised you in terms of how these narratives are being shaped and distributed? Are there any new trends?
What we have seen over the past decade, maybe a decade or even more, is the fact that indeed, and that's why I mentioned this ongoing project where we are trying to measure and to track the types of content that are being circulated online and consumed online. And you are totally right. Sometimes it's only because of quantity and because of the sheer, scope of these propaganda narratives that they are actually gaining a lot of. They are gaining a lot of leverage in this competition for trust and for people's attention. So, in other words, when we look at all these types of content flooding our communication fields and our communication devices, the media content indeed is losing ground quite a lot. And people, as you say, in many countries, not only all over the place, we sometimes do this kind of research. You have better connection with people, but very often when we do surveys or for example, we are starting now a project based on interviews with users of social media, trying to understand what people do, how they live their lives, and what are they doing, what are the motivations behind their decision, to spend time and consume content on social media. And you are totally right. People do not, we always talk about saving journalism and independent media and all that. People don't want to save anything. They have jobs. They want to save themselves, I think, not journalism. If you give them the information that they need, and which is important and relevant for their immediate, tasks and work, job-related information, there is a lot of people migrating and moving around for jobs and other reasons. If you give them that kind of information, if you give them information that is relevant for their economic status and for how they are living, if you give them information about their family and all that, they will consume it. Whether it's journalism or not, they don't care. They will go wherever they find that information relevant. And of course, sometimes they don't realize that the data or the content that they consume sometimes is just fake or totally false. And that's the problem. But that's a different discussion. It has to do with media literacy, and not media literacy that can be done in a year, but it has to do with the revamping of the educational systems and making people more aware about it. But back to your question, yes, we have that issue. I mentioned the fact that it's even more important to have editorialized content, and journalism is very important. It doesn't mean that it will succeed. I think, in fact, independent journalism is in probably the worst state or the worst position it has ever been. There are many media outlets struggling to survive. So financial sustainability is a problem. Secondly, there are many, for example, investigative journalism networks that have appeared more than a decade ago, and they produced amazing content and they continue to work. But again, there is no sustainability model for them, and very often they have to fund themselves from grants. They are out there, they produce content, but I think the overall trends, and what you asked me, what surprised me, is that in many countries, in fact, the government's role in the media is growing, both in terms of financial involvement and control, and that leads, of course, to less informed population, and that further destabilizes, I think, the sustainability of the independent media sector, which is seriously in trouble. Of course, you have some countries that are still having solid references. I think one problem that we have in this new communication field is the loss of references, and a lot of companies, including social media, are fighting for that space. They are trying to build systems of references to say, if you want the truth, come here. We are the source of information. But of course, that is very hard to achieve, and it's even damaging when companies or media outlets that are not independent are achieving that status.
Yeah, because we're living in the time of hyper-personalization, so we are losing this common narrative, so to say. But that I want to ask a little bit more questions about that as well. So staying on the subject of propaganda narratives, are there any regional peculiarities in how people use deep fake technologies, or is there more universal appeal and approach? What are your observations on this?
Well, there are obviously differences. I think there are common trends, and I think you have all over the place various, layers of the population, people consuming false narratives and not being aware. Other people, we also saw examples of people, being aware that some of the content is false, but they just consume it because they just want to see what people are producing. So I think you have these trends all over the place. You cannot stop that. On the other hand, there are differences between media systems, as we call them. And I remember some years ago with a colleague of mine, we wrote about this topic and about the national resilience, what we call to disinformation. So basically, we try to understand whether it's important to have in a country, for example, a solid public service media and trusted public service media, whether that is a factor in, staving off the waves of disinformation, for example, or how people behave to that. And yes, there is something in that. If we measured at the time, for example, Finland, which has a trusted public service broadcaster for many years that people reference to and that people trust. And they also trust it because they know that politicians didn't have access to that, or in spite of the fact that sometimes they want it. I mean, it's Finland, we know, but even in such countries, politicians sometimes, when they gain power, they try to take control of the public service media. So it happens there as well. But still, the fact that you had that kind of independent, trusted news broadcaster had a lot to do with how people perceive disinformation. It has to do also with the media literacy level, schools, and there are many programs in the country, and not only in Finland, that have been educating students not only to spot disinformation, but to understand how to actually check the sources of information, how to make sure that they know who's producing and who's behind the media outlet. So it really depends. If you look at countries across Europe where we study this phenomenon, there are countries where it's clear that if you have countries with more tradition of independent public service media are doing relatively better than the other ones. Then, of course, the factor of education is very important, as I mentioned. And then, of course, you have probably some specific characteristics of the country. In Romania recently, last year there were elections, and out of the 12 or 13 candidates for the presidency, in the first round of elections, the highest number of votes were won by a guy who nobody knew, who actually ran all his campaign on TikTok. And of course, when you go back, a far right guy, but also a mentally deranged guy, totally mentally deranged. And the fact that so many people actually bought that, and this is what we are trying to analyze now in a project that I mentioned to you, why these people, listen to a guy who said that, the H2O is not formula of water and things like that. And sometimes some people said that they actually voted for this person because they were sick and they were fed up with the political class in the country. Well, you can agree or disagree with that, but what's important here is, again, to think about how people are consuming the information, why they do that, and that has to do, I think, in the Romanian case, also with the fact with how, in fact, people are consuming the media in various circles. So there are common trends that we see probably in most of the places, but then there are factors that I think affect very much what we call the national resilience to disinformation.
The Romanian case you mentioned kind of reminds me of Argentina, because their new president, again, I was surprised that so many young people, because he was big on TikTok in Argentina as well, and he used AI technologies widely and creatively, actually. So I'm surprised how these young, basically school kids, the people who voted for the first time, they voted for him because they were just fed up with that years and years of socialist Peronistas, interesting, kind of alarming in a way. I wanted us to talk also about big tech and media, marriage, love affair, hate affair, what is going on. So your think tank, correct me if I'm wrong, tries to avoid accepting financial support from big tech and governments. But many media organizations are dependent on big tech. People receive grants from Google News Initiative and Meta, etc. We distribute contents through platforms we neither own nor control. What are your thoughts on this? Do you see it as a healthy or toxic relationship?
I think it's to a certain extent. I think the involvement of the tech sector in the media is healthy because of the reasons that I just described. Many media outlets, especially those operating in media captured environments, they have a major issue and major problem with their sustainability. So they don't have access to government money, taxpayer money. Sometimes the local advertisers are not using them because they fear repercussions from the government. So they have to somehow, go for grants and so on. And to a certain extent, I know examples of media outlets that, in fact, with the Google grant, they managed to grow and they are now doing okay. They just use the Google grant at some point in their development to actually, build a subscription case, for example, and then they manage to thrive. So the short answer is, to a certain extent, that's fine. But when that is becoming an overwhelming, support, and when the role of the tech companies in the media is growing to a level where we talk about what the independence of media outlets and how they cover tech, then I think we have a problem. And yes, you are totally right. At the moment, we have that issue. We have tech companies funding a lot of research, funding a lot of media outlets. Also, it's very problematic because, as you said, a lot of media outlets, but not only media outlets, everyone, including our center, we have to build a presence on social media, otherwise nobody would hear from us. So this relationship is very problematic from this aspect, because you have think tanks, media outlets that are in a very imbalanced position compared to the very powerful tech companies. So when they also get involved to a much higher extent than expected, or than it should be allowed by these outlets, then we have a problem. Because very often, to give you an example, it seems to me that tech companies are funding, for example, research, and when you actually look at that, after they are gone, after the grant is gone, a lot of these outlets are succumbing, they are dying. And then the question is, well, when you really look deep into the issue, the whole project was actually designed to benefit the tech companies. They very often use these outlets to actually collect data and to test their models and all that. So I think there are huge issues there. And I think on the one hand, I understand media companies and people, our colleagues in the research field, because I know how difficult it is to refuse financial support, and you have to do it. But on the other hand, I think it's very problematic when you cross a line, and that is going to affect your credibility and independence. I also want to mention, we study at the center what we call the media capture, which is a phenomenon that we have noticed in a number of countries, that it has 4 elements. Regulation. This is when the government controls the regulators. The second is public service media, when the government controls public service media by naming people on their governance structures. Misuse of public funding to control the media. So basically the government is giving state advertising to their friendly outlets. And then the 4th element is takeover of private ownership. In many countries, they use private companies to take over media outlets. Then they are turned into propaganda outlets. So when you think about this model, when you control regulation, public media, for public funding, and private media, you basically control everything. And why I'm mentioning that is that when we developed this model and we started to track media capture, the internet, the tech companies, the social media was in fact the salvation, was the only space for independent journalism to be able to operate. So in highly captured environments like Turkey, Hungary, but also all over the place, like in Cambodia and other places, Egypt, the only space for independent journalism, threatened by capture, was to go online and operate online and launch their media outlets online. So at that point in time, the tech was in fact the solution. Now, when we look at what is happening in recent years, and especially again after the elections in the US, where tech companies aligned visibly. And
I wanted to see a look at Meta, Google, Microsoft, and others. They kind of showing their allegiance to Trump's administration. So they become increasingly partisan. How then any sort of not even financial connection with them will become a reputational liability for the media industry, but it will affect the trust in general, no?
Yes, and now when we look at that, in fact, the tech sector from the solution is becoming the fifth element of capture, because if you as an independent journalism you cannot take a job in the public media in your country because it's controlled by the government. You cannot take a job in private media because they are controlled by the government. You cannot get a grant because the money is given to the government controlled media. You cannot open a radio station because the regulator is controlled by the government. Now you lose even this space where you could actually openly set up your own media outlet because this is controlled by the government. Now, when the tech companies are aligning themselves with governments, and it is not only the US elections, but for some years now, we have noticed in some countries, for example, in Europe, when tech companies open a local office, sometimes you see that, for example, on the search engines and on how they prioritize content, that there is a shift towards prioritizing content coming from government media. And of course, it's very hard to establish the causal link or to prove, this is because they are pressured by the government, but it is becoming obvious. And we are studying those kind of trends as we speak, but we kind of more clearly see that the tech sector is becoming a fifth element to capture. When you look at what you have, these new forms of capture because of how the tech is changing, we are kind of stuck, because if you want to operate independently, as I mentioned, you don't have access to licenses. You cannot launch your own broadcaster. You don't have access to public funding. You cannot take a job in the public media because they are controlled by the government. You don't want to do that. Most of the private media are controlled by the government, and you are stuck online because whatever you do online, your content will not be prioritized by the company. So where can you go? And it's actually kind of impossible to imagine a scenario where you have this enlarged phenomenon of capture, because it's a situation where there is nothing you can do basically if you want to do independent journalism.
No, I don't want to hear there is nothing you can do. There must be some solutions, right? But what are the solutions? How can the media industry become less dependent on big tech?
Well, there are two options. One is the policy option, but I'm not going into that very much, because media policies that, for example, support independent media, public service media, and all that we always discuss that. But the regulation and policy solution, unfortunately, in media capture environments are part of the problem, not part of the solution. To have a progressive policy supporting independent media, you need a government to agree and to believe in those principles, and that's the problem we have in many countries. You don't have that kind of government. So let's park that one, but I'm not dismissing it. I think media policies are very important, but you need the government to be able to listen to that. But if you really want to survive, I think a solution is there are two ways to think about it. I think one is to think about new ways of engaging audiences. And we have heard that for decades, how to engage audiences and so on. I think we have to look at audiences beyond the media metrics. We always, when we think about audiences, we think about people consuming our content, but we never look at them from the other side to actually go into their communities. We have to realign this relationship, because always as journalists and media outlets, we only think about readership or audiences as people who ensure our visibility and through them access to advertising money. I think we have to change that completely. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect that has to do more with sustainability, again, within contexts where it is very difficult to survive, I think is the need to establish a new relationship and a tighter relationship with the private sector. We as journalists, we see the private businesses as the source of funding, as advertisers. And of course, they do the same. They have a commercial logic. They advertise in the media based on some principles. What is the audience? We give them the money. We share the money that way. But I think there is more than that. And we have seen, in fact, in some countries, the fact that some private businessmen are thinking about the role of independent media, and sometimes they are scared of living in a place where they don't have independent media. A good example is the Czech Republic, where many years ago a group of businessmen meeting regularly for this like business mixers or lunches or whatever. They were. It was at a time when there was a big threat in the Czech Republic with one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, businessmen in the country was becoming prime minister, and they were thinking, "Wow, we have the Hungarian, scenario coming to the Czech Republic," and many of them said, "This is going to be very bad for our businesses because." In a captured environment, the relationship between us and the government will change drastically, and even our businesses will be threatened by that. And of course, that was a long discussion, not only at the philosophical level, but they said we have to do something as the business community. So they established an endowment, which is still in place and in fact is doing very well. They put money together, and then of course there's this small group, but then more companies came together and they increased the endowment. And over the past, since its establishment, I think in 2016, so it's been already 8 years, this endowment had done miracles. They funded a lot of independent content that otherwise would have died. And in fact, the Czech Republic is one of the few examples in that region that managed to actually, combat and prevent further capture. They managed to get rid of populists. And I think that's a very good example of how the private business community has been somehow attracted and made to really understand the role of independent media. It's not easy though. They speak, journalists and private businesses speak a different language, but I think this common interest, so to speak, I think has to be raised, because some of the private businessmen interested in the idea of independent media are out there, but they don't know how to approach it. And that discussion has to take place. And that's, if you think about it, this is one of the only ways for media outlets to survive financially. I'm talking now only about financial sustainability.
Yeah, and kind of remain independent. And it's just the whole question about independent and being independent is like a very tricky question. Let's talk about regulations and ethics. So your think tank and you personally have been looking into social media regulations during elections. Let's talk about AI regulations. Imagine if you were on the European panel of the highest AI committee. What would be your top 3 AI-related regulations that you would issue immediately, and why?
Yeah, I don't think we have a sufficient research material to talk about that. We haven't done. Of course, we have met the AI field from the perspective of media and journalism. All I can think of is a set of ethics-related policies that would ensure, for example, transparency. That's all I can think about. Of course, it's extremely important. It's a huge issue, and in fact, we are following up on that issue. But I think when it comes to media and journalism, there shouldn't be restrictions. Our principles here are always not to restrict, not to come with negative policies. Even when it comes to, for example, tech companies, I don't agree sometimes with these policies saying you have to oblige tech companies to remove content and so on without any due diligence in place. I think the policies have to be more like positive. You have to have policies in place that promote, for example, independent media, that prioritize good content, not that remove content. So from along the same lines, I think when it comes to AI regulation, what I really desire is to have regulations that would not forbid or punish media outlets for using some AI tools. But on the other hand, I think there should be regulations in place that would create incentives for media outlets, to check what tools they are using, to make sure that they are transparent about the tools they are using. And I think that because that will lead to certain standards, and that's always is better. Media industries and media systems that work are those that have standards. If you don't have standards, you have corruption, you have lack of transparency, and sometimes policies that are going into that direction are not helping.
Do you actually believe in regulations, in the implementation process, I mean?
Well, yes, I think it has to do with, again, if you look at various countries in Europe, you have examples where regulations work and do not work. And I think it has to do a lot with, for example, how people perceive public goods in a place, especially when it comes to the media. It has to do with the tradition of regulations. It has to do with the trust of people in authorities. When you go to Eastern Europe, you have great laws, for example, in many countries, not everywhere, great laws, great policies, great regulations, but they are not implemented, because when it comes to the implementation, you have institutions that are politicized, and the laws are there just to be written. And that's why in these countries, you always talk about, for example, mechanisms to ensure transparency, mechanisms to monitor, for example, the work of regulators to make sure that they are independent, because their governance structures are appointed by the parliament. But then, just to give you a very concrete example, we had in a recent project, Finland, again, included in one of our studies, and we had this in the same study that we applied the same question to that. Is there any mechanism to monitor the activity of your media regulator? And the experts in Finland, they said, no, we don't. And they added, but we don't need that. We are still a constitutional democracy. I mean, people vote, people to represent them, and those people make decisions on people's behalf, and it works. Nobody complains about that.
Finland is kind of becoming, everybody uses it as an example, but look around you, where is another Finland?
Yes, totally. But that has to do again with how people value public good in their places. It has to do with transparency of regulation. It has to do with people's trust in authorities. And in most of Eastern Europe, people don't have, because of the communist legacy, they don't have that trust. And I'm not saying that, at the same time, this doesn't mean that things do not change. Societies change, so we shouldn't say this is it. Eastern European countries are doomed; they will never change. No, that's why we have these processes. That's why in some countries, like the Baltic countries, for example, the Czech Republic, I gave you the example. There have been notable, improvements in how people perceive regulations, accept regulations, and all that. And of course, when you go to other places, like even we keep giving the example of Finland, but we studied others, Nordic countries, they are not perfect either. So they have this, of course, more like advanced understanding of regulations. They have a more trust for the authorities because things have worked in the welfare state and all that. But when you look at that, they also go through problems. The public service media in Finland, for example, is now coming under a lot of pressures because the government wants to change the funding model, and they know they want to do that because they know that this is for them the path to control the public media. So it is, it's not a country, there is no perfect country in the world, but I think there are obviously, obvious, differences between various nations, and the societies are always changing. So we shouldn't, I'm not saying that in any cynical way or in any, fatalistic way. We have to do this work, and we have to, of course, do this work where it's needed.
And we probably can't use one set of regulations in one industry, say in journalism, and a completely different set of regulations in another. So we are interdependent and connected. And trust is a single dial. You can't dial down trust in one area of society and dial it up in another. Do media organizations have any influence over it, though? And who does?
Obviously, like in any industry, obviously there are several players exerting influence. One of them is the industry. Always the industry is at the table of policies and regulations. Then you have sometimes, and there should be more involvement of civil society. Unfortunately, it doesn't have that kind of influence. And then, of course, you have various political actors who are part of the policy-making process. So it's usually the same players. When it comes to the media field, definitely media companies have a say there, but it's usually the large companies, as it happens even at EU level, the same you have at national levels. And this is something that you cannot change, of course, because they have a major stake in that. From what we hear, and I'm traveling a lot in most of the countries in Europe and meet the people from media companies, private media companies, from the industry. I'm part of panels discussing that. I was part of a great panel with CEOs of the largest media companies in Poland last year. And the general reaction to what is happening both at EU level but also at local level is that they want less regulation. And I agree with them. I think when it comes to media outlets, I think always less regulation is healthier. Of course, that doesn't mean that media shouldn't be regulated anyway. You need a regulator to give licenses and all that. I think what is more important for the field is to have more proactive and more what we call self-regulation, meaning leaving the industry, to introduce standards and to regulate itself, because that is very important for media companies and journalists, but also for those, for example, that are breaching the journalistic standard. If you have the whole industry rallying behind some principles that are universally accepted, then those, for example, fake news or disinformation sites will not have a chance to survive. So this is the overall feeling, I think, in right now in the media industry. It has been like that, in fact, for many years, but now with all we see coming from Brussels, I'm not saying it's bad. In fact, a lot of directives and regulations coming from Brussels are praised all over the world as being the most advanced. But I think sometimes they are not applicable. They are not realistically, applicable in some context.
Revenue and business model is one of the topics also your think tank and you personally research a lot. What do you think media organizations need to change to survive and stay relevant?
As I said, if you really talk about independent media outlets, what they have to change, I think, is first of all their approach to the audience beyond the metrics and the usual formulas that they have used, and the second is to reframe their engagement with private business. I think is the only way. I'm talking now about media outlets in difficult places in Europe, in other parts of the world. On the other hand, there are, when you look at, for example, the media sector in many countries, we shouldn't forget that some very good independent media companies are not doing bad. We map revenue and fund revenue and income revenue and profits in a number of countries. When you look at some of these companies in Britain, the Guardian had like hundreds of millions of pounds in revenue a year in recent years. This is a good sign, because I think it really shows that to a certain extent, at least in some places, the journalism is valued also financially by people. That means that you have advertising, that you have people buying your subscriptions, or however they are financed. But when it comes to protecting your independence, I think normally you should be like the model again, going back to the Nordic countries, is like a balance between an independent public service media and the vibrant private media industry that coexist, and they function according to some principles. But in many places, you don't have that kind of balance. You have public media that is controlled by the government, and then you have the government controlling a lot of the private media. And that's obviously something that is very hard, that can be hardly described as an environment for independent media to survive.
So let's talk about public service journalism. You've been researching this topic for years. So what is the biggest challenge that public service journalism in Europe faces today? And what are the possible solutions?
I think it's more or less what we have discussed already. I think that the biggest threat is media capture in countries where this is happening. And in other places, I think it's the continuous pressure from tech platforms. Maybe the best way to answer your question is by maybe referring to another project that we are conducting. I'm personally involved in that, where we are trying to understand the media ecosystem across Europe only using the financial criterion as the main criteria. So basically what we do, we collect data about media companies, trying to understand how they are funded. And based on that, then we try to understand what kind of media system do you have. And so far we have come up with 4 systems in Europe. One is the media captured one that I described to you already.
So the media captured is where high government control, right?
Yeah, the government is present in public media, but also in the private media, and almost in any kind of in any space of media related regulation. So it's very high government control. Obviously, you have very little competition. You have as we call instrumentalized journalism, meaning journalism that is not independent but serving the government. So this is a model that we find in Hungary. Poland was almost on the way to become one. Czech Republic was threatened by one. Slovakia now is sliding into that. We have examples in Bulgaria as well. So you have this in some Eastern European countries. The second model that we see is what we call the atomized model. And this is atomized because, and we found it in Romania, in some Balkan countries, you have a huge number of outlets. So at the first sight, it seems to you that this is a country that has a very vibrant media industry with a lot of competition. But when you start to analyze their ownership structures, usually these are people, not only politicians, but businessmen, for example, that start a media outlet or buy a media outlet with a very specific purpose, usually being supporting their businesses. So their journalism is, again, very instrumentalized, is not independent. And this is something that is not captured because you don't have a powerful political group controlling all of them, but you have a lot. That's why it's atomized. But when you look at that, you don't have independent media there because basically they operate just sometimes to attack each other, to attack somebody else, or to support the purposes of your owner. And sometimes you have examples in these countries that are, hilarious, where, a media outlet is set up by a journalist, funded by a company for like 6 months until a company win a certain tender, and then they close it. So it's that kind of level of, instrumentalization. Then you have the third model, which we call the platformized and corporate model in countries like Ireland, UK, France, where you have media outlets that are in fact doing well financially. They are large. They have developed into large structures. Sometimes in this model, the media companies have more influence over the government than the other way around, and you have relatively independent journalism in these systems. But the problem is that you still have some interference of the government in public media in some of the countries, and sometimes because of these corporate structures and the closeness to the tech platforms, you start to see that what we call some sort of regimentation. When they are independent, but when it comes to certain topics, sometimes not all of them are truly independent. And then we have the fourth model, which is the public interest model, because you asked about public interest journalism that I mentioned in Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, where you have free public media, private media sector that works very well with advertisers, investing based on a number of principles. And that I would say is the ideal media system. Of course, it has its own problems. I answer your question how public interest journalism should be protected and what journalists should do. I think we have to keep in mind that where exactly do you mean? Because in some places, I think some places offer the solution. The Nordic example is a solution, but for that you need policies. You need policies that protect your public service media. If you live in a country with a media capture environment, what you have to do is to actually survive and attack the system from within by better reaching your audiences, by trying to get funding from private businesses and all that. If you live in an atomized model, as I mentioned to you, I think what you have to do is to try to, again, I think the audience is crucial, and I think you have to in fact expose the system, because the corruption in these systems the atomized systems is very high. If you live in a corporate platformized model, I think what you do is you already have places where you can do public interest journalism, and what you should do less is to try to cut the links where you become regimented. So it really depends where you operate, but there are solutions.
If we try to zoom out, how relevant are all of these models in the world where generative AI is becoming a new storytelling medium? It's not just a tool, it's an entirely new storytelling medium. AI can dynamically generate stories with scripted characters and unscripted outcomes, so-called constant flow. It can create content that adapts in real time to individual viewer preferences, making hyper-personalized storytelling a reality. In that world, where every viewer is an audience of one, what do you think the perception of facts as such would be? And how that type of storytelling medium might change the perception of non-fiction reporting?
I think it will change the field immensely, of course, but I think the impact will be different. It's very hard to predict that, because this is a revolution that is developing and growing, and it's very hard to really predict how it will change for example, the journalism field. But definitely, it will have huge changes because of what you just described. because some media outlets will adopt this form of storytelling and content production. But I think it will also the change and the impact will be different based on the local context, because and we saw that even with the internet, when the internet revolution started 25 years ago, the whole media ecosystem was disturbed, and all the media companies try to catch up and to cope with the changes. But those, for example, the media companies that had a very strong link with the population, that had a very strong brand, and so they managed to overcome that. And what we see, as I just mentioned today, some of these companies make hundreds of millions of euros a year in revenue, which is huge. So I think the same. And speaking about media systems, and I think the impact will probably be different. Whatever AI tools you will use, I suspect that in countries where the audiences have a strong relationship and trust media outlets, that the impact will be probably lesser. I'm not saying it will not have any impact at all, because it's hard to predict that. But for talking about Germany, for example, the Germans, whatever, they consume whatever media outlets, and more serious, less serious, tabloids and so on. But when it comes to news, the public broadcaster has remained the most trusted news bulletin in history, and it doesn't change. So that tells you a lot about what we talked earlier about reference and how people. And I think that will be very hard to dismantle by an AI supported new media that will appear in Germany. So back to your question, I think the impact will be different from place to place. But I don't expect, I don't rule out unexpected, shifts in various places, depending where the systems will go.
No, I'm just thinking that given the trend toward hyper-personalized storytelling through AI, how might this affect the traditional role of public service media in creating shared national conversations and cultural touchpoints? Are we risking kind of further social fragmentations? Because we will not have a shared national conversation in that kind of world.
Yes, we are risking that. And that is, in fact, when it comes to public service corporations across Europe, the most advanced ones are having exactly this debate that you are mentioning now. They realize that for them to stay relevant, they have to actually respond to hyper-personalization trends in a way that will be universal and inclusive as they have always been, which is more difficult now. It was easier 30 years ago, but it's more difficult now. But that's exactly, and I think those who will find the answer to your question, I'm talking about these public service corporations, they will probably have a very good, great future.
Marius, just blitz questions, very short question, just one sentence answer. Don't think, just fire. What are your three dominant emotions about the rapid development of AI? Emotions, not thoughts.
Excitement, curiosity, and fear.
Everybody has it, excitement, curiosity, and fear. The future of journalism, how would you describe it in 3 words?
I think threatened, still having some opportunities.
So more opportunities, more threat?
No, I think it had, what I wanted to say is that in spite of some opportunities, I think it still faces the biggest threats ever.
One more question I wanted to ask you. What makes you optimistic about the future of journalism, and especially public service journalism?
I think one thing that makes me not necessarily optimistic, but makes me think that there will be a major change is the fact that we see kind of a huge shift in the social media ecosystem. And this is something that, of course, tech companies do not report, but we've seen a number of studies. I think we feel it ourselves. Look at Facebook and what is happening there. I'm not sure, a lot of people do not see value because there is increasingly commercial. There is overall with all the social media kind of not necessarily, I think, fatigue, and people, I think, are looking for something else. For now, the answer was TikTok, which is yet another social network and not necessarily, very progressive. But I think people would react positively when it comes to a system that gives them reference and the system of communication and socialization that responds to their needs. Beyond commercial gains, beyond advertising. I don't know how that will be called, but I think a system that will have a network, a social network built on public interest principles would very much resonate today with a lot of people, meaning, with their problems, their interests, not what social media are selling to commercial companies. And how to build that, of course, that's not easy. But I think in that respect, public service media can play a role because they have the infrastructure, they have somehow in some places the connection with the people, but they have to really change the way they operate. A lot of these companies do not manage to do that because they still operate based on structures that were inherited from the 90s, and they have to entirely change that. But I think people are waiting for something. Everybody is waiting for something new in this field.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of AI Fluent with me, Ilona Vinogradova, and feel a bit less alone in your newsroom's everyday struggles. This podcast was produced by Lovin Films Pro Media Lab. If you would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Share it with your friends and colleagues if you think they might find it useful or inspirational. And if you really like this podcast, review it on your listening app of choice. It will help us to reach more storytellers and make them feel part of a bigger community. I hope you'll join me next time. Until then, take good care of yourself and each other.